Hi, everybody. My name is Vijay Ramasamy. I'm the Governor's Special Advisor for Water. I want to thank everybody for joining today as we talk through the implementation of the State Water Plan. But I'd like to begin with a welcome and a little bit more on the Governor's agenda from Governor Laura Kelly. Governor?
I'm just going to come over here. They say that third time is a charm, so let's try it all over again. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar and express my gratitude for your dedication to resolving our water issues here in Kansas. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So, when I was on the road campaigning for my second term as governor in 2022, I fully expected to hear about the usual issues, taxes, education, roads. But to my surprise, the issue that came up repeatedly, whether I was east or west, north or south, was water. It became clear that Kansans believe a clean, sustainable water supply is one of the most important, if not the most important, issue facing our state. And I agree with them. And that's why I've decided to make resolving our water issue a top priority for my second term. Over the past few years, thanks to the work of many of you on this call, we have made significant progress. When I first took office, the state wasn't even funding its own meager portion of the state water plan. Thanks to your advocacy and the support of key legislators, we fully funded the water plan for the first time in over a decade. Last year, the legislature added $35 million per year for the next 5 years. That additional money is making a difference for Kansas, from our small towns with leaking pipes to farmers looking to implement new water-saving irrigation practices. Legislative leaders also passed a framework to empower local initiatives to stabilize the Ogallala Aquifer. And groundwater management districts are currently developing strategies to address critical water quality and quantity issues in their communities. My administration formed the Kansas Water Subcabinet with experts from various agencies to increase coordination of water management and to aggressively pursue all federal funding. But we know there's more to do. There are parts of the state that have fewer than 25 years of usable water left, and others that will face severe risks to their reservoir capacity in the event of another 1950-style drought. We cannot afford to slow down, for us, for our children, for our grandchildren. And that is why I've charged the Kansas Water Authority, led by Chair Don Buehler, to work with you all to create an implementation strategy for water, one that meets local needs, adapts to changing water issues, and one that's accountable and transparent to the public. Throughout last year, you all showed up to make your voices heard. Regional advisory committees met a total of 28 times across the state in just 4 months to share ideas and priorities. We heard from farmers, crop insurers, feedlot owners, and bankers, over 1,500 stakeholders. Conservation districts, city officials, and rural water districts attended every meeting to ensure local needs were addressed. I want to specifically thank Chair Buehler for her leadership on this effort and the entire Water Authority for their diligent and thoughtful work over the past year in creating the state's first strategic implementation framework for water. And what we heard from you was clear. Kansans want more investment in water. Years of underfunding water created a substantial backlog of needs. We need to treat water like we treat transportation, with a large-scale, dynamic, and long-term program to ensure a multi-generational approach and promise on water. We need to be practical and transparent with state money as we ramp up to a large-scale program. And we should start by finding more effective and efficient ways to use our current or any additional revenues. More specifically, Kansans requested better access to state water services by streamlining water programs and making state water management more efficient. More focus on problem solving by tracking outcomes and investing in high demand projects that show measurable progress on the issues outlined in the state water plan. An independent evaluation of existing programs to show return on investment for all water funding. State government is best when it is responsive and accountable to the needs of its people. And that is the core of my water agenda this year, implementing what you asked for across the state. That's why I'm proposing a bill to create an Office of Natural Resources. This office will be led by an executive director and will include the Division of Water Resources, the Division of Conservation, and the Kansas Water Office, bringing together most state water functions under one roof. The bill will also eliminate a statute that allows some decisions of the chief engineer to be reviewed by a political appointee, ensuring the independence of the chief engineer as originally intended by Water Appropriations Act. I'm continuing our commitment to water funding by recommending an additional $30 million to build on the priorities outlined over the last year. That means more funding for projects, infrastructure for small towns, high-risk dams, irrigation technology cost share, developing a project pipeline for long-term water issues across the state, and more. It also means investing in an independent evaluation of our programs, improved transparency on how dollars are making a difference for communities, and more local technical resources to help our small communities meet long-term needs. The feedback you provided over the past year provides an excellent blueprint for building a 10-year water program for the state, like our 10-year transportation program. Now it's time for the legislature to start building this type of program with a dedicated revenue source. Making progress on these priorities will be hard, but we have more momentum than ever. There is no time or place for partisan politics when we're talking about preserving the future for our kids and our grandkids. There will be a lot of discussion about the budget this year and where we place our financial priorities as a state. We need you to let your local representatives know there are real and growing water issues in your communities, and we cannot afford to slow down on resources, implementation, and organization. I want to thank you again for your leadership on water issues in our state. I look forward to another productive year. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Vijay to discuss in more detail what my administration is proposing this year. Thank you all very much. Take care. Have a good meeting.
Thank you, Governor. We're going to go ahead and walk through a presentation that lays out in a little bit more detail the governor's agenda this year on water. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. But as I do that, I want to remind everybody that the presentation that I'll be showing today is posted on the Kansas Water Office website. And so if you'd like to follow along as I go through the presentation, you can go to the Kansas Water Office website underneath this calendar invitation for this presentation, and we can walk through it. All right. Hopefully everyone can see the screen and hear me. Before I start, I'm just going to say we're going to add a recommendation to this for new audiovisual equipment for the entire state. So to watch out for that. One more addendum here to the implementation framework. I want to thank you all again for not just coming here today on a Friday afternoon in a very busy time, but for showing up consistently, like the governor mentioned, over the past year. I want to specifically thank the Kansas Water Authority, Chair Don Bueller, our regional advisory committees, producers, conservation districts, cities, towns, everybody across the state that showed up in really difficult, busy seasons for all of you to provide your input on the Kansas Water Plan and how we can actually implement that Kansas Water Plan to show measurable outcomes for Kansans across the state. Look, the core of this effort was simple. The core of this effort was that we want to ensure that state investments on water meet three goals. One, they're responsive. They're responsive to your needs today and tomorrow. As your needs change, as your community's needs change, and as our world changes, we want to ensure that state investments are responsive to the growing challenges around water. The second thing is that we want to ensure that state investments are accountable. We want to ensure that we have measurable outcomes for all of our state programs and investments so that you know how we're making progress on all of the issues in the state water plan, whether it be preserving the Ogallala Aquifer and the High Plains Aquifer in general, whether it be securing our reservoirs, whether it be addressing water quality concerns across the state, making sure that we are secure in the face of droughts and floods, how we are educating our Kansans across the state in every industry in our public schools around the importance of water. We want to ensure that we are accountable and transparent. And the final thing is that we want to ensure that we are accessible, that our programs are accessible, that they are efficiently run, and that you know where to go for different water services and programs, and that those programs meet the needs in your communities. All of your work over the past year, providing us important feedback, has led to this report, the Kansas Water Implementation Framework, which is available on the Kansas Water Office website. I will walk through a few pieces of this implementation framework, but you'll hear more about this here as we do presentations to the legislature, as we work with all of you to really figure out how we can put this framework into practice. To give you kind of a high-level overview of some of the recommendations that are in this implementation framework, the first thing is something that all of you heard about over the course of all of our meetings over the past year. It is that we need to set a goal to deliver a multi-generational promise for water in Kansas. That's our North Star. That every generation, no matter what, is ensuring water for at least the next 2 generations, our kids and our grandkids. And that always happens. We know that there's areas across the state where this isn't true, that communities have 50, 25 years of water left, where communities in the event of a 1950s style drought will see real water supply risks. That delivering this promise is going to be difficult. It is going to be important for the future. And I really want to underscore that this is a process. This is a North Star, and this is something that we want to work towards as a state. The second recommendation is around regional planning and project development. We've heard over and over again that a state without a plan is a bad investment. Unless we can assess our long-term risks as a state, basin by basin, and develop a list of projects that we can use to ensure that multi-generational promise, we won't be able to achieve it. States like Texas do this already, and it's important that our state works with local partners, works with our GMDs, works with our cities and towns to ensure that everybody is planning for the future and knows what risks lie ahead for economic development, for population growth, for everything. The third thing is around regionalization. We've heard this over and over and over again, that we need to ensure that if we have public water supply systems, sometimes connecting those systems where possible can make things more efficient, more effective, and secure those water supply sources for those individual drinking water systems. Ensuring that that's a part of state policy is a key recommendation here, and we'll talk a little bit about how the budget even supports local resources for communities to develop these types of projects moving forward. The fourth thing is something we heard over and over and over again, streamlining water programs. We know that we're pretty unique as a state in having 14 different agencies that work on water. Sometimes it's difficult to know where one program lives, how to get a specific service, or how to ensure that you can access these programs effectively. So having a no wrong door policy is what we're aiming for, that no matter where you go in state government, you can know how to access different types of water services across the state. The next thing is about transparency. We've heard again and again that we need to give communities good contextualized tools to know how their water supply functions today and tomorrow. So being able to understand your water supply risks in your community, your water quality risks in your community, and actually track your progress towards that multi-generational promise at a community level is going to be incredibly important, and we want to help build that tool moving forward. The next thing is something that we think is at the core of our operations, regardless of any additional dollars, which is emphasizing problem solving through outcomes. Legislators, community members, folks across the state said over and over again, if you are spending taxpayer dollars, we want to know how that is impacting the 5 issues that we've laid out in the Kansas Water Plan. How many streams are you delisting? How many irrigation systems are you providing audits for or cost share for? How many reservoirs are you addressing with in-lake sediment management so we can secure them for the future? Unless we can show you how these outcomes are going to solve your problems, that's not an effective use of taxpayer dollars. And so you'll see in this report a list of outcomes by agencies to show step by step what we're going to achieve in the next 2 years and what we could achieve with a 10-year program. The next few pieces are around kind of our operations as a state. We've heard in many areas of the state that we want to support local areas that are taking action, especially on water depletion in the Ogallala Aquifer. There are many areas of the state that have local enhanced management areas or water conservation areas that are taking action to reduce water use. And we want to be a good supporter of that at the state level through investments and cost share programs for water use reduction, for example. And so supporting that and prioritizing those high risk areas is going to be incredibly important for us moving forward. And the last piece is around enhancing federal collaboration. Kansas can't get this done alone. We are going to need federal resources, but also partnership with federal agencies that have a role in our reservoirs, in our land management, and our water resources moving forward. We also need to advocate for more money at the federal level for the state and ensure that the Washington understands that if they want to preserve the agricultural production of the state, if they want to ensure that this entire region of the state succeeds moving forward, there has to be more investment in Kansas and its surrounding states. So what does that do and what does that mean for the governor's agenda? Today, I'm going to talk about 3 parts of the governor's agenda that's meant to be responsive to what we've heard over the past year. The first one is an increase of $30 million in the State Water Plan Fund for ramping up our operations, our investments, our outcomes as it relates to problems related to water in the state. That brings total funding for FY26 in the governor's budget to $90 million. One key piece of this is that this is financed by interest on the Budget Stabilization Fund, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But this provides a temporary dedicated source for increased water investment in the next few years while the legislature determines a long-term dedicated source for water in Kansas. I know a lot of you have provided really good feedback over the past year on different types of sources, fees, and we want to bring that to the legislature this year as they have discussions. As the governor mentioned, it is critical that just like we have a 10-year transportation program, we need to have a 10-year water program, a rolling 10-year water program to address our needs and take chunks out of these big, important, expensive water issues. Because if we don't invest now, they're only going to get more expensive in the future. And the governor's budget makes a commitment to be responsive to the types of programs and projects that you asked for over the past year. The second thing is an Office of Natural Resources. This is directly responsive to asks over the course of the last year in these meetings around making sure that state operations are efficient and accessible. We are unique in having over 14 different agencies that work on water, but we can help to change that if we start working on an Office of Natural Resources, which can be a point person for water funding and investments, but also help ensure that we're streamlining our programs and being more accessible for folks across the state. And the last thing in the governor's agenda is working with the legislature on a legislative task force to create a 10-year program for water. This will be a legislative-driven task force with stakeholders to understand how that 10-year program would be structured, what the dedicated revenue source is, how it will be evaluated, how it will ensure that it's meeting needs across the state, just not one area of the state, and across all the issues, including water quantity, water quality, our reservoirs, education, resiliency, all of these important needs. And we think that pushing the momentum for this task force and really getting a 10-year program done using what we've learned across the state over the past year is going to be a really important step for making sure that water is a fundamental state role in Kansas, similar to transportation. Let's start with the budget. At the start of the Kelly administration, as the governor mentioned, we weren't even funding the small part of the Kansas Water Plan that is the state's obligation. We were looking at about $16 million a year of water funding. We know now that that's definitely not enough, that investments in water today will reap benefits down the line. So over the course of the year, thanks to the legislature, the House Water Committee, the work of you all as stakeholders in beating the drum on water funding, we've increased water funding in this fiscal year to over $67 million to fund infrastructure, cost share, and a whole host of priorities. But what you told us is that we need to keep the foot on the gas, that we need to keep ramping up to a large scale program with evaluation, with outcomes, and with accountability. You also told us over the past year that there are projects and investments that we need to increase in order to address the needs now while showing the value of water investments in the future. That's why the governor is going to provide in her budget an increase to $90 million a year on funding. And our hope is that that only increases as we talk about a 10-year program. Now, before we get into the FY 2026 budget, I want to talk a little bit about how the state agencies and the administration is being responsive to your needs and effective with your taxpayer dollars around water. One of the things that we heard is that we need to be dynamic, right? As we see projects and demand across the state for certain programs, if we have money that's just sitting there or not going to be spent, or there's a program that we tried that didn't work, then we need to be reallocating those funds to accelerate where there is high demand. And so, in addition to asking for the additional $30 million, what you'll see from us as state agencies this year is reallocating funds that may go unspent in this fiscal year to accelerate projects and meet demand. That money will also go towards kickstarting a lot of the recommendations that I talked about earlier on long-term planning, on program evaluation. The key here is this. We have had years of discussions around water in Kansas. But we as a state need to be responsive to those needs and show how our dollars are actually meeting the recommendations that you all have asked for over the past year. Just to give you an example, we're going to reallocate $1 million of FY25 funding to accelerate progress on the Burton chloride plume project, where chloride contamination poses a large threat to groundwater for producers and eventually Wichita's water supply in the Equispeds aquifer. This is an example of how basin by basin long-term planning plus project development can help us create a good project pipeline where more projects like this can be accelerated and we can address the long-term risks to every basin across the state. We're also going to be reallocating funds for the stock watering program, which promotes efficiency upgrades for our feedlots and dairies, which had an $11 million demand that we couldn't meet with just $500,000 of funding. There's also money for more contamination remediation projects, which affect groundwater near towns and cities and parks. And there's more money to kickstart independent evaluation of our programs to show outcomes, and also that long-term water supply planning and project development that I mentioned. So we're not waiting until fiscal 26. We're getting started now to implement a lot of the recommendations that you all have provided over the past year. So just to give you a sense of how we're looking at this, the $30 million, $14 million of it will go towards high demand programs. $10 million will go towards infrastructure and technical assistance support for mainly small towns through the House Bill 2302 program. As many of you know, we had over $200 million of requests last year for just $27 million of funding. There's a lot of demand out there for infrastructure, especially in our small towns, and we want to help meet that demand. And there'll be $6 million for new initiatives directly tied to priorities that you asked for over the past year. Here is a high-level summary, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, just because I'm going to walk through each of these pieces in detail. Another thing that we want to focus on this year, and you'll see this in the way that our budget is structured, is no longer focusing on 40 different line items that are sometimes confusing to understand how they actually lead to progress on our 5 guiding principles. Instead, we want a budget based on problems and problem solving. And so we want to show you transparently and clearly how much money we are spending on each of the 5 major guiding principles, and then what that's achieving. And that's a shift in the way that we're dealing with the state water plan. It treats the water plan as a true investment fund that's focused on actually solving problems and being transparent to how money is spent across these different areas. And I'll walk through each of these in detail. Let's begin with water quality. And I'm going to just walk through kind of all of the enhancements within the governor's budget related to water quality. And the governor's budget was released just yesterday, and that's available on the Governor's Budget Office website, so please take a look at that. The first thing is an additional $1 million for the Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, or RAPS program, which provides BMP support, best management practices support to landowners to improve water quality, reduce sedimentation in high-risk areas, and a whole host of other priorities. This enhanced funding will go towards a specific type of thinking that a lot of you asked for over the past year, which is prioritize our funding and evaluate if things work. So this additional $1 million will go towards implementing RAPS in one target watershed to address one specific problem and be paired with an evaluation of the program to illustrate its return on investment. Again, shifting the thinking to be responsive to your needs about being accountable, transparent, and prioritizing so we can make progress on a lot of these different issues. The next thing is an additional $500,000 to support private septic system upgrades and well testing for low-income rural Kansans. This money would address and help support testing in 15 additional counties. This is really important because we heard that there's not enough support over the past year for those rural landowners, for those private landowners, especially as we look at significant water quality problems for their wells. And finally, there's an additional $1 million for contamination remediation to help address these contamination sites where the culprit is no longer in business. And we have, as a state, an obligation to protect public health by addressing groundwater concerns. And these are in your cities, these are in your towns, in parks. And there's over 140 of these contamination sites across the state. And we need to keep making a strong dent in remediating these sites. We will also continue funding for the Groundwater Quality Monitoring Network, non-point source pollution, and a host of other programs that we funded last year. Next, let's talk about water quantity in the aquifer. In the governor's budget, I want to first start with an $800,000 enhancement to accelerate the aerial electromagnetic mapping of the aquifer that we just did in Northwest Kansas in GMD4. Basically, the electromagnetic mapping allows a spatial understanding of the aquifer. So it allows us to see how much water actually exists in different areas of the aquifer with an incredibly high resolution. Folks in that area have talked about how that's helped improve local decisions. Empower already started planning efforts at the GMD level, and we think it's important to do that across the aquifer. And so we're going to add an additional $800,000 to accelerate that program and get it done in GMD1 and GMD3 in Southwest Kansas. And that acceleration will save about $1 million in contracting costs for us. And so targeted investments to save taxpayers money and keep progress moving on all these issues. The next piece was, again, a response to local requests for targeted funding, not expansive funding, but targeted funding to support communities in Western Kansas with less than 50 years of water supply left. We currently have programs that help communities, especially in Western Kansas, purchase water rights voluntarily, working with their landowners to purchase water rights to secure their water sources. We heard from you all that a targeted program or targeted increases are going to go a long way in making sure that a lot of communities in Western Kansas that don't know if they have enough water for the next 25, 50 years can work with their own local landowners to figure out if they can buy certain wells and secure their water sources. So we'd like to add $1 million there. The next piece is $1 million more for the feedlot and stock watering program to help address that $11 million demand. Feedlots are a critical part of our water future as the major buyers of agricultural products, and their leadership, especially over the past year, on implementing water-saving technology and being a part of the conversation around addressing the issues in the Ogallala Aquifer are really important, and we think an additional investment there is a great idea. The next piece is $500,000 to ensure funding to match a $25 million federal grant that's currently being implemented by the groundwater management districts in concert with our Division of Conservation to reduce water use while maintaining profitability in the High Plains Aquifer. This money will go towards addressing cost share, but also technical assistance to producers so that they can help address local priorities and local planning around water use reductions to help stabilize the Ogallala Aquifer. The next piece is an additional $500,000 for water resources cost share funding that goes directly to local conservation districts. This funding helps conservation districts meet local needs around soil health management, irrigation technology, and more across the 105 different conservation districts that we have in the state. I had a chance to visit a conservation district in Rush County a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's important to note that they are local staff that impact local needs, and they work with local landowners to build trust around some of these water quality and quantity practices that we think are really important. The next piece is an additional $1.75 million to help support and retain and hire staff at those local conservation districts. There was a bill in last year's session to increase the state match for those local districts, and that carries about a $1.7 million fiscal note. That bill was passed through proviso last year, but we expected that bill to move forward this year, and we want to make sure that we support these local conservation districts and in order to have local staff that can help implement a lot of these programs that we've talked about in a trusted way, along with the state. There will also be continued funding for interstate water issues, water use database modernization, which a lot of you have asked for to help make our operations more accessible, the High Plains Aquifer Partnerships Program, which has done a lot of incredible work over the past a few years, especially on bringing together producers, on testing new technologies, expanding peer-to-peer education for producers, and really kind of serving as the backbone on outreach for irrigation partnerships across the state. The next piece is on our reservoirs. Kansans get 2/3 of their drinking water from our reservoirs, and there's reservoirs in the state like Tuttle Creek that are set to fill up by 90% by 2070. It may seem like it's a far way away, but it's really not. These are our kids. And I think it's really important to note that if we don't take care of in-lake sedimentation of our reservoirs, we will not be able to grow economically. We will not be able to sustain our populations. And in the event of droughts, we'll have real important and very dire water supply risks. And so in order to keep the momentum on our reservoirs, we're investing another $3 million in new funding for a hydrosuction pilot in John Redmond. Many of you know that we invested a few years ago in a water injection dredging pilot in Tuttle Creek that is set to start this year to help manage sediment in that reservoir, and we want to keep the momentum going. John Redmond is critical for over 100,000 Kansans and our power supply here in Kansas, and I think it's really important that we continue this type of investment. The next piece is an additional $1 million that was added specifically from the Water Authority recommendations for partnerships with local landowners above our high-risk reservoirs. So we're not only addressing the sediment that's already there, but we're preventing more sediment from getting into our reservoirs through buffer strips, cover crops, and a whole host of other practices. This investment will help go towards the Reservoir Protection Initiative, which then works with those landowners in high priority reservoirs across the state. There will be also continued funding for stream gauging, evaluation of our reservoir water supplies, and our overall storage, reservoir storage operations and management obligations with the U.S. Army Corps. The next piece is on resiliency, which really focuses on the long term. Building good infrastructure, promoting regionalization, addressing our high-risk dams, and ensuring we have a long-term water supply for economic development and population growth. So the first piece is $3.75 million to conduct the long-term water supply planning and project pipeline development that I talked about a little bit earlier. States like Texas already do this. Basin by basin, region by region, they can tell you what are the long-term demands on our water supply, how much water do we actually have, what's that delta, but also what are the risks to our water supply. The Equispeds project is a great example of a risk to the long-term water supply of that region. We need to have an accurate picture of that across the state. So as we bring in new businesses, as we look to invest across the state, we know how much water there is now, how much water there will be in the future, and project that so we can actually have good, sustainable development across the state. But this is not just a state obligation. This has to be done in partnership with our local entities, our GMDs, our cities, our towns, so that we have planning and long-term planning as a part of our culture in Kansas, and we can ensure that legislators have a great project list across the state about what we need to get done for water to ensure a long-term water supply. The next piece is the Public Water Supply District Engineer Program, which is a local resource that used to exist in the 1990s and early 2000s that places technical expertise in each of the KDHE water supply districts to support small towns as they apply for grants, helps address emergencies like Caney before they occur, and really serves as a local resource to support communities as they address different water supply issues. The next piece here is on dam construction and rehabilitation. We know there's over 500 high-risk dams across the state that have huge impacts if they fail to human health, human safety, and economies in general. And we want to increase our inspections and dam investment. All of these are responsive to local requests for more resources at the local level to help address issues in our towns, more money for projects, especially on our dams, and the need to think about that multi-generational promise with a strong long-term water supply planning infrastructure in the state. The last piece here is the House Bill 2302 program. We're adding $10 million to help address the over $200 million of requests we've seen for technical assistance and grants in this program. The last piece is in research and education. So we've talked about over and over and over again the importance of evaluating our programs to show they're effective and ensuring that we have outcomes for accountability. But that doesn't happen unless it's independent and we have money allocated to do so. So there's $910,000 in FY26 specifically for independent reviews of our programs and investments in metrics for transparency. The next piece is a match for a sorghum research collaborative, the 10-year Center for Sorghum Improvement in Kansas. This is an existing partnership between multiple institutions that helps promote research and investment around sorghum as a water-saving crop in Kansas. This would bring in a 4-to-1 private match. We thought this would be a really good investment as a one-time project to help ensure continued research on sorghum moving forward. The last piece is another ask by our stakeholders across the state, especially our agricultural stakeholders. There are a lot of domestic water rights holders that don't have their water rights quantified with the state. And having that quantification has been an ask of Kansas Farm Bureau and other folks who have really said, if we want to make sure that these domestic water rights users know their rights and are at the table, we need to have some infrastructure of the state to help address that quantification. So this is a one-time $1 million project to do outreach, database improvements, and other investments to help provide some extra support to help those domestic water rights users quantify their water rights. There will also be continued funding for public education and outreach, the Kansas Water Office, soil health education, and then continued investment in some of these research projects that we've invested in across the state over the past few years to ensure that we have good assessment of our public water supplies, investing in crop and livestock research, and making sure we have an accurate picture of our reservoirs moving forward. I want to reiterate here that your input informed this funding approach. Our key here is to be responsive. So you asked us that we want a steady glide to a large-scale program. We talked about $140 million across the state. That may be too little, that may be too much, and that's for the legislature to work on over the course of the next year. But we think that we want to be responsive to your needs as it relates to increasing funding to meet key projects across the state. And you also told us that just bringing in a whole host of money next year is not going to be the right thing to do. We need to slowly make sure that we're increasing the amount of money so that we have the right evaluation, processes, and return on investment to justify additional dollars. So that's why we have this ramp up approach. You also told us that we want to support project development. That's why we've increased support for local resources and planning. And finally, you asked us for more funding for support for local infrastructure, and that's where that additional $10 million comes in. These are just a few examples, but we want to show how we're being responsive. I'm not going to go through this specifically, but this just provides a specific example in each of the problem areas around how our recommendations connect to the recommendations in the framework. So how our budget connects to the implementation framework. And again, this is a part of not just providing a document or not just doing these meetings, but actually showing people how those meetings led to investments and budget decisions and prioritization at the state level. The last piece I want to talk about with the budget here is a shift to a focus on outcomes and transparency. Over and over and over again, legislators have said, and community members have said, we have provided additional dollars through House Bill 2302 for water. What is that buying? And we want to shift our focus as it relates to the State Water Plan Fund to outcomes and being clear with you all what we can achieve. And so the report and the framework that we've published provides outcomes for the ramp up, so the next 2 years, but it also provides what we can achieve in 10 years with a large scale program. The key here is that we can make huge progress on those big, important problems that we talked about in the State Water Plan if we have these successive 10-year programs, right? In 10 years, we can address the top 6 reservoirs in terms of reservoir sediment management. We can ensure that 50% of our irrigation systems across the state have technology upgrades, that 75% of them have system audits. So we can save 15% or more on water reduction. We can address 20 different feedlots and dairies with stock watering upgrades. This is the type of reporting and accountability that we want to bring to the State Water Plan Fund and a shift in our thinking to focus on problem solving. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the specifics around the Kansas Office of Natural Resources. You heard the governor mention this in the State of the State around the fact that we are very unique in having so many different agencies that relate to water. Kansans have to navigate multiple agencies for issues related to water quantity, conservation programs, water policy, and planning. Additionally, the chief engineer's decisions currently by statute, some of those decisions are subject to review by a political appointee. And finally, there's lots of opportunity for efficiency and coordination on our investments so we can ensure that we're driving to outcomes. Other states have already done reorganizations to help create a focus and efficiency around natural resources policies in their state. Kansas is behind. And we think that an Office of Natural Resources, which I'll go through in a second, is a great first step to try to centralize a lot of the different issues related to water quantity, conservation, and planning across the state and ensure better access for folks as they relate to services and programs. So the Kansas Office of Natural Resources, and this will be a bill and not an ERO, will include the Division of Water Resources within the Kansas Department of Agriculture, the Division of Conservation, which is also currently within the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and the Kansas Water Office, which would be renamed the Division of Water Policy and Planning. It would be led by an executive director who would be Senate confirmed and would serve as a single point of contact for legislators and for community members on natural resources issues. It would also provide us a way to streamline a lot of the investments that exist across so many different agencies to provide policymakers, but also you all as stakeholders, a better understanding of how water funding is being spent across the state. And finally, the governor's proposal will restore the independence of the chief water engineer by eliminating any political review of their decisions. The chief water engineer's decisions will be final agency action, still appealable to district court, but as the original Water Appropriations Act intended, the chief water engineer is a regulator who should be independent, and that person should not be influenced by any political actions, regardless of administration. We want to restore that independence within this proposal. The office would be established by July 1st, 2026, if enacted, providing a year for transition. And I just want to say one thing that's very important to us is to limit disruption. And so all existing duties and functions of those agencies would stay consistent. No state employees would be required to move to the Topeka office. Only the executive director will be required to maintain an office in Topeka. And we want to ensure that once that executive director comes on board, they can help streamline and make sure that our programs are more accessible, that we have a single point of contact, and help provide better communication on all of our water-related investments. The administration will introduce this proposal as a bill and not an ERO. We want this to be a conversation with the legislature as we think through how to manage water in the future. That is a collaborative discussion. And so we will introduce that bill here in the next few weeks, and we hope for a productive discussion on the ways that we manage our water in the state. The last piece is around what does the future look like for water funding in Kansas? All of you over the last year told us two things. You want to be bold. You want to be bold in your goals and the things that the state takes on and the issues that the state solves. But you also want to be practical. You want to ensure that there is responsiveness to local needs, that we are spending taxpayer dollars effectively, and that we have a process for ensuring that there is effective evaluation of our programs. We think that a 10-year transportation program is a great model for how to institutionalize water funding as a key role of the state moving forward. But this is a legislative conversation around a dedicated revenue source, around a large-scale 10-year program. That is a legislative and stakeholder conversation. And so we want to introduce a bill in the next few weeks that would basically take the model that we had for transportation. And in 2018, legislators and stakeholders met to develop IKE, which is our current transportation program. We want to do the same thing, but for water. So creating a water program task force that would be in charge of a few things. It would be made up of legislators and stakeholders to determine the aspects of a 10-year program, so how funding would be prioritized, the criteria for selecting projects, how funding will be evaluated, how to ensure geographical diversity, so every area of the state is getting addressed, how to ensure that all of our issues are getting addressed effectively. The next thing would be a dedicated revenue source. We cannot make large-scale investments in our water infrastructure, in our water programs, and address these problems if we don't have a dedicated revenue source. You can't address a reservoir based on year-by-year funding. It requires dedicated funding to be able to effectively plan projects across the state and implement them. That's why we think a 10-year model is helpful. So we believe that that task force should, using a lot of the feedback that you provided over the past year, develop that dedicated revenue source and ensure that water is enshrined as a role of the state moving forward. That legislative task force would be intended to meet over the course of the next year and develop a bill for the next session. And we'll unveil a little bit more of those specifics as we work with legislators over the course of the year. I just want to say here that your engagement over the past few years, especially in the leadership of the legislature, is the reason we have a lot of the new investments that we have on water, and we want to keep the momentum going, and that is the intention of the governor's agenda. So last thing that I want to talk about is, how does this work? If all of this stuff gets implemented, how does it actually help solve our problems? So let's walk through kind of in a timeline how that might work. So right now, if our proposed budget passes, we have 2-year outcomes that have been established for all of our investments that you can hold us accountable to around all of our different water issues. We would work to establish evaluation metrics and build capacity for a prioritized project pipeline across basins across the state. This summer, the legislative task force would start meeting. They would make recommendations and work with all of you to make recommendations on a revenue source and funding levels for that 10-year water program after the ramp-up period in the next few years. The Office of Natural Resources would begin to be implemented, which would help kind of streamline a lot of these investments and provide a single point of communication. Next, in January 2026, informed by the legislative task force's work, we'd have a bill on a 10-year transportation program. We would get to kind of reevaluate how this year of increased water funding looked and continue to increase water funding moving forward. So keep investing in good projects, show you how we've spent the money over the past year, show you those evaluation metrics, and continue that ramp-up process. In fall of 2026, the Office of Natural Resources would again hold local consultation meetings across the state with regional advisory committees, with local stakeholders, just like we did this last summer, so that you can hold us accountable. And just like transportation, we do that every 2 years. We'd then also show you, hey, we said we were going to achieve this. This is what we actually achieved. We were successful here. This program didn't work out. Let's get feedback here. Let's shift these programs and really be responsive, similar to how we work in transportation. We will also have strong regional priorities and a project pipeline so that legislators and community members know what needs to be invested in to ensure that multi-generational promise. And finally, in January of 2027, the legislation is enacted for a 10-year program. We've done the 2-year ramp up. We look towards implementation of a 10-year program. Funding levels are tied to evaluation and metrics. We have a clear local consult process to get feedback and increased funding commitment across the state to address these problems. That is the goal. It is efficient management paired with a dynamic 10-year program that will continue to make progress on that multi-generational promise. And in 10 years, we can make real progress on our water issues. We can ensure that all Kansans have access to at least 50 years or more of clean water or have a plan to achieve it and a list of projects to achieve it. We can return 150 rivers and streams to clean for all use status. We can ensure that 100% of our sediment is managed in the major 6 reservoirs impacting 1.7 million Kansans and really show people the effectiveness and value of continuing to invest in water. These are all only done through partnerships, but we want to be accountable to these types of outcomes and show people that these problems may be big, they may be difficult, but we've already seen lots of examples across the state of how we can address them. I'm going to end here. We need your help this session. Momentum on water is higher than ever, thanks to the work of all of you. But as we have a lot of new legislators, as we have a lot of new demands on state funds and revenue, it's going to be incredibly important this year more than ever for you all to reach out to your representatives, your senators, show up in Topeka and make your voice heard about why we need to protect water funding, why there is immense demand in your communities for producers, for reservoirs, for municipalities, and how if we don't invest now, the problems are only going to get more expensive. The most effective way for us to protect water funding and increase water funding is for you all to reach out and say, these are my priorities. We need to continue to invest. We need to get more efficient at the state level, and we need dedicated revenue source and a 10-year program. The other thing that I want to point out here is that revenue source that I mentioned to fund the ramp up, so the $30 million additional over the next 2 years, comes from interest on the Budget Stabilization Fund. That is a really smart way to make sure that we have a protected source for water while legislators come up with whatever the long-term source is on water, whether it be a sales tax or whatever it is. It is going to be incredibly important, and my ask to all of you and the governor's ask to all of you is to make your voice heard about why we need to protect that source for additional funding for water moving forward, why we need a long-term dedicated revenue source for water, and we need to cement water as a fundamental state role for the state. And that only happens with your continued advocacy as you've done so effectively over the past many years. And with that, I'm going to take some questions, and we've got our state agency experts here on the line, and we'll take a few questions to kind of walk through the agenda.
Thank you, Vijay. This is Matt Unruh, Assistant Director of the Kansas Water Office, and I am joined here in person off camera right now by Connie Owen, Director of the Kansas Water Office, and it does look like Earl Lewis, Chief Engineer, Department of Agriculture, Division of Water Resources, and Leo Henning from KDHE are online as well. So we have received several questions in chat. So any of our agency representatives that are on the line right now, if you want to contribute to any of this, feel free to chime in. But maybe first off, we have 2 questions that are Office of Natural Resources related, and so I'll kind of combine them into one question. And Vijay, maybe if you would lead off on this, and if there's any other feedback to provide agency reps, please feel free to do so. Questions would be in relation to the Office of Natural Resources. First part would be, is this an agency to develop policy, not a regulatory agency? So kind of the planning policy versus regulatory aspect of the Office of Natural Resources, as well as the note of it being an office rather than a department. So is there any difference that an office does that does not have a cabinet member? So kind of the cabinet, sub-cabinet aspect of the Office of Natural Resources, as well as the regulatory versus policy related aspect of the Office of Natural Resources.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to just start with that piece around the office being a non-cabinet agency versus a cabinet agency. The intention here is to build on years of legislative discussions that have already happened on reorganization and be responsive to some needs that we've heard and some concerns we've heard from legislators and stakeholders kind of across the state when we're talking about a non-cabinet agency versus a department. We think that this proposal is a great start. A non-cabinet agency provides the ability to centralize all of those functions into one office without the need to create a whole new department in state government. We've heard concerns from legislators and folks and stakeholders about creating new departments in state government. And the important thing here is that we are reorganizing existing functions and duties into a more efficient office. One piece there that's always important in these discussions is how is that person going to influence and work with the governor and the cabinet on these types of discussions. Our commitment within this administration is that that executive director of natural resources would be invited to every cabinet meeting, would be a part of the governor's agenda and policy discussions, and a source of clear communication for legislators and stakeholders. And so we think that to be responsive to stakeholder concerns, to create the most efficient and effective proposal possible that looks to make sure that we are streamlining programs, we thought that a non-cabinet agency and office versus a whole new department would be a really great start for the discussion. On the second piece, I think it's important to note that this would bring in three major functions of the state. One is water rights management and regulation, which happens at the Division of Water Resources. The second is a lot of our conservation programs and cost share, kind of our implementation of the Water Plan Fund, which a lot of that happens Division of Conservation. And three, our water policy and planning functions. The way that the legislation will be set up, all of the existing duties of those agencies would be ported over to this office. Although those entities around policy and regulation exist underneath the same office, the important piece here is that any regulatory decisions by the chief engineer, any regulatory conversations are separate and independent, right? And that will continue to happen just as it has under this administration. To go a step further, like I mentioned, the chief engineer, we will modify statute to ensure that there is no political review by the executive director of natural resources on any agency actions by the chief engineer. And so you can still appeal those decisions to district court as you can do with any final agency action, but we don't want to have any political interference around regulatory decisions to the chief engineer, which was envisioned in the Water Appropriation Act as an independent regulator. And so we think that these functions, putting them into one office, will make things more efficient and effective for you all, while maintaining that independence for the regulatory aspect, which is so important to the state.
Thank you for that, Vijay. And I do see that there are maybe several hands that are raised as well. For those of you that are listening into the webinar right now, I'd encourage you for any questions you do have to type them into the Q&A. So for those of you that do have hands raised, if you're wanting to ask questions, I'd encourage you to type those into the Q&A chat. Second question would be in relation to some of the regional water supply planning. So Vijay or Connie, if there's anything that you want to contribute to this, feel free to do so. But question being, it sounds like much of the work will be conducted for that regional water supply planning on a watershed or basin basis. Is this accurate and intentional? So further background on some of the regional water supply planning aspects that are being prioritized with this framework.
If it's okay, I'm gonna actually have Earl take this one as if you want to speak a little bit at that, Earl, and I'm happy to follow up if that's okay.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I think when we think about regional planning, we think about, say, the Neosho Basin or the Solomon Basin, and I think the thought is that we would hire probably an outside consulting firm, that the agencies would identify what all the issues are in that specific region or basin, whether that's water supply, flooding, water quality, or those type of things, and ask that outside entity to take more of an engineering approach, if you will, and say, what are all the options to address those issues we've identified? Do the cost benefit for those, pros and cons for each of them, and then come back to the agencies of the water authority and say, here are all the options. Here's the cost. Here's what the recommendations would be. And then we'll be back over to the agencies of the Water Authority to say which of those we want to move forward as part of that project list. And so, I think it'll be kind of that mid-level, right? We've got the overall state planning, we've got local planning, whether that's communities or groups of communities, and then we've kind of got this mid-level, which is the regional, which I think this is really what this is targeted towards.
Appreciate that, Earl. Next question would be in relation to some of the previous legislation that was passed, particularly when it comes to House Bill 2279 and some of the groundwater management district reporting and sustainability planning related efforts. There's a question on status of funding for House Bill 2279.
That's kind of squarely in Earl's shop here. So Earl, go ahead.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks again. And so I think, the majority of the work, in my opinion, for the groundwater major districts under 2279 is primarily outreach and communication and then development of plans at this point. I would also say that there is significant funding in this proposal for the aerial electromagnetic mapping. We've certainly funded modeling in the past. The agencies stand ready to work with the groundwater management districts to look at different alternatives and provide feedback as they work on what those plans are. So we haven't had any specific requests beyond what we've got in the budget today from any of the GMDs to say that they need funding for 2279. The other part that I did miss there is, already starting to think about implementation and obviously we've got the RCPP that the Division of Conservation is working with the GMDs on, as well as significant funding in this proposal for irrigation technology and outreach. So I think there's a lot of pieces to it, but I think where we're at in the process, the GMDs are still firmly in the outreach and plan development portion of the process.
Thank you for that, Earl. Next question would be, and Vijay, you touched in detail regarding kind of the overall structure of the Office of Natural Resources. One of the questions that was brought up is specifically in relation to wildlife and parks, but this might apply to some of the other water or natural resource related agencies. How would the Office of Natural Resources affect, in this case, Department of Wildlife and Parks and their programs as a whole?
Thanks, Matt. I think that it's important to note that all of our agencies will continue to partner on issues that are shared across the agencies. You'll notice here that KDHE Environment is not a part of this. That's also a response to what we heard in previous legislative conversations and stakeholder conversations around reorganization. But same thing with wildlife and parks. There will be no impact to wildlife and parks' existing duties and functions and budget, but this office is intended to be a partner with wildlife and parks on any shared issues, including the aquatic nuisance species reduction funding that is a part of the water plan fund. That is a partnership between our state agencies that work on water with wildlife and parks. All of those partnerships will continue, but the intention here is to not impact those agencies and their functions, but start to bring together a lot of these important functions around the water plan fund, around our water services and our natural resources services in general. The other thing that I'll say here is that this only elevates the importance of natural resources within the state. This provides a single executive director. It allows natural resources, a majority of our water plan funding, for example, to be housed under one agency, and we think that this is a great step to improve that transparency. So short answer to your question, not an impact to wildlife and parks duties and functions, but we'll continue to partner on the areas that there's overlap.
Thank you, Vijay. And one of the other questions we had in chat was in relation to KDHE specifically. So you touched on that as well. So thank you for that additional background. Another question we have, and Earl, this might be one that you would want to touch on, specifically in relation to the chief engineer position, a question of what decisions are currently subject to review by the KDA secretary.
Yeah, thanks for that. And there are a number of different orders that the chief engineer by statute has that then are potentially or currently reviewable by the Secretary of Agriculture. Those can include civil penalties related to overpumping or violation of the water right. There's also maybe one of the bigger ones is determining whether or not a Lima or a Lima or another instrument like that meets the statutory requirements, or whether it should move forward or not. So it's mostly about legal orders that are issued by the chief engineer and whether or not those should be reviewed by Secretary of Agriculture or Director of Office of Natural Resources if this would go through.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Earl. Another question we have, and this touches on the topic of regionalization and some of the sensitivities or issues regarding regionalization when it comes to cities and adjacent rural water districts. Maybe Vijay, if you'd want to touch on, or Leo or anyone else really, question of how is regionalization going to be implemented within this new framework. So any feedback on kind of water supply regionalization within this overall structure?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Matt. And I can go ahead and get started, and then I absolutely want to turn it over to Leo. The importance I just want to start off with is regionalization where possible, right? And we want to have that discussion at the local level and help support at the state level however we can, with resources, with technical assistance, whatever we can to support those conversations at the local level. We think that there are areas across the state where regionalization or connection of these water systems can help make things more efficient, can help ensure that we are securing your water supplies. Caney is an incredibly good example of this. Caney is currently working on a project to connect to Coffeyville to secure their water supply and ensure that they won't have some of these same water supply risks moving forward. But these are difficult conversations. These are conversations that can't be done overnight. And it's not the state intention in any way to force these things, but it is to empower these conversations. So the few ways that we are doing that is to support that planning at the local level. So evaluate whether or not you can regionalize the effects of it. If it's beneficial to you, that is something that we want to promote so that you have a clear understanding at the local level how that impacts your community. The second thing is local resources. And so having those district engineers can work through those projects. There's a lot of reason why we have really strong regionalization projects in Southeast Kansas is because there used to be a district engineer there that worked with those communities on when it works and when it doesn't. And the last piece is around our infrastructure funding, right? We can provide different resources at the state level to help support those types of projects. So while we believe, and we've heard from the Water Authority and folks across the state, that regionalization is a really good tool for our towns and communities moving forward, we understand it's a difficult conversation and one that we want to have the pros, the cons, how it would work, and support that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Leo for any additional comments.
Yeah, this is Leo Henning, and I would just say that VJ did a very good job of answering the question. These are very difficult conversations to have at the local level when it comes to regionalization projects. What we foresee is providing information, technical expertise, and trying to provide a direction. But there's no mandates. We just want to provide everyone with the information, and then it will be up to the local entities to make those decisions. But John, I hope that answers your question.
Let's maybe stay with both Leo and Vijay on this one. And Vijay, you in your most recent response touched on some of the infrastructure funding related aspects of ongoing discussions and this overall implementation framework. Question of, has there been any discussion regarding declining funding in state revolving loan fund programs for public water supplies and how that might have some role in funding plans and discussions?
I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to Leo as the expert on that piece.
Well, that's a good question, Fred. I think you know that the declining state revolving loan program funding is because of earmarks at the federal level. It's a new thing that our legislators and Congress have started to do, and it does hurt the amount of money that the state then receives to loan out to programs. There are some ideas to address this. I don't think it's quite ripe yet to talk about because there needs to be a lot of discussions that occur before we talk about the potential ideas that we have had here at KDHE and with the governor's office, but we do know that there's an issue there. But we need to flush that out a little bit more, the way that we would like to solve the issue before we really talk too much about it on our webinar now. But BJ, you got anything to add?
Yeah, I just like to say this is a really good example of why we need a 10-year program. There are a whole host of infrastructure issues across the state that are really long-term, expensive issues, and there are different types of needs across the state. The needs for a small community around being able to finance these projects without affecting the quality of life and water bills for their communities versus a mid-sized city or town versus a large city, those are all different. There are other states that have dedicated water infrastructure funds that are kind of tiered based on, if you're a small community, you can maybe mostly get grants, mid-tier and large communities, maybe it's a combination of financing. But this is why we need a 10-year program, right? This is why we need to continue to push more infrastructure funding in the state because these these problems will only get more expensive. And unless we do effective planning, unless we do effective project development, unless we think about the long-term risks from a water quality or quantity perspective, we won't be able to address these problems and we'll be stuck with the bill, right? Caney's a great example. When an emergency hits, we are going to have to pay for it. So being proactive all the time is going to be really important. And that's why this is another example of why we need a 10-year program and a rolling 10-year program on water with a dedicated revenue source.
Appreciate that, Vijay and Leo. So Vijay, let's stay with you for this next one. And this kind of gets to the Office of Natural Resources. And at least from a branding standpoint, the implication that it would have a larger purview than just water. So as you're looking at kind of other natural resource related concerns or topics, do you anticipate adding additional focuses such as grasslands in the future?
So the intention is to start, having a kind of a broader a conversation, right? And I think that's why we've included the Division of Conservation. We also know, and all of you know much better than I do, that conversations, about land management, about soil health, all of these things also impact water. There's a lot of, there's a lot of overlap on some of these pieces. And so we think this is a great way to start that discussion about natural resources being a role of the state. We definitely want to continue those moving forward. But the intention of having Division of Conservation there is that there's a lot of overlap and we want to make sure that we have effective coordination of our programs. That being said, our focus in the State Water Plan Fund on making progress on water plan goals will not change, right? So there may be some, overlap in ways that we can work together on natural resources in general. But when we talk about state water plan funds, our focus is to make progress on those guiding principles and those outcomes. And so short answer to your question is it was intentional to call it the Natural Resources Office. We know that this is a broader conversation and we want to have that conversation with the legislature.
Appreciate that, Vijay. I think you maybe touched on a couple of the other questions that were in chat regarding kind of the status or makeup of the overall Office of Natural Resources. So appreciate that. I guess the one final question that I see in chat is in relation really to the financial assistance components of this overall implementation framework and kind of obligations or thoughts of providing financial assistance opportunities for irrigators, feedlot, dairies, etc. So questions, thoughts, feedback otherwise regarding some of the conversations that have taken place from this ongoing strategic implementation planning process over the last year, feedback that you've received from public or other stakeholders regarding utilization of taxpayer resources for those sort of financial assistance opportunities.
Sure. I can start, and I think this probably touches everybody, Connie, Leo, Earl, so please jump in here, right? And so this really goes to how do we take a large problem at the state level, like declining, water resources in the aquifer, and figure out what the state role is, right? There is a lot of incredible work happening at the local level, the work that's happening in Northwest Kansas and GMD4 and GMD1 with water conservation areas, with LIMAs around locally led conservation efforts that really try to ensure reductions in water use to stabilize the Ogallala Aquifer. But we know that those types of water use reductions are helped, are supported, are empowered when we can provide kind of the spark through cost share. Right. So if there is a irrigation technology piece that we can test out with producers, this is where the Water Office High Plains Partnership Program is a really good example. If we can show folks why implementing some of these pieces will not only help water, but also help their bottom line and help make sure that they can have profitability, that helps build the culture of conservation that many of these groundwater management districts, I know, with Katie Durham and with Shannon Kenyon, those folks have really, in Western Kansas, kind of helped start building that culture of conservation. So that is a state role, right? If we can help do that cost share and help producers and folks reduce water use, that is a great state investment towards our goal. Same thing with feedlots, right? It is cost share. It is saying, let's help kickstart the use of these technologies so it spreads across the state, builds that culture, and helps show the transition to a stable aquifer that is driven by those local leaders. And so we think that these types of cost share practices are a great way to empower local work, and we'll continue to partner with local entities. The other thing that I'll say is that none of this gets done without staff and staff resources, especially technical assistance resources at the state and local level. Partnering with GMDs, partnering with local entities. That's where the district engineer piece comes in. If we don't have people that are dedicated to go out and work with producers, work with everybody like our GMDs doing on a day-to-day basis, we won't be able to address some of these problems. And so that technical assistance piece plus cost share is a great state investment, in our opinion, to make progress on some of these big problems. Earl, Connie, Leo, any additions there?
I'll take the first shot, and then if Connie and Leo want to join in, that obviously that'd be great. I think as I read that question, it's really hitting on kind of a tension that's been in the water policy and water law for really decades, where the Water Appropriation Act dedicates the water to the use of the people of the state of Kansas, but it does so by allowing development of private property rights for use of that water. And so that has been, again, a point of policy tension and discussion for a long time of how much of it we say is that's the state's water and you're using it versus how much of it is a question of it's a private property right that we have allowed somebody to develop. And so this, as Vijay correctly pointed out, these incentives to try and cost share are kind of trying to bring those two pieces together to say we're trying to reduce the overall water use of your private property right, recognizing that our public resource, that water, has been over appropriated from what it can sustain in the long term. How do we bring those two together? And so, this is a fundamental policy question. There's people have very strong opinions on all sides, and obviously, we'd encourage you to let your voice be heard with your legislators and policymakers. But that's kind of how I think about it is really trying to bring those two different pieces of our state policy together.
This is Leo. The way I look, the conservation of water is at every level. I know that we tend to talk about feedlots and irrigation technologies, but we could be doing conservation in our cities also, in our drinking water and other areas. We are going to try to start emphasizing this with municipalities. Is just because you have water today, we should also be looking at conservation measures in the cities also, and trying to reduce the usage of water, even in areas where we think we have lots of water. So I guess that's the only thing I would really add to this subject.
Yeah.
Great. This is Connie with the Water Office, and I would echo what Leo said. I think it's very important that we all develop and encourage the development of a water conservation mindset for all water users all across the state, whether they're agricultural or municipal or industrial. When we bring companies into the state, we should be requiring them to have water conservation and water reuse methodologies. we need to be very mindful of the amount of water that we have available for municipalities, industries, everything, and figure out how much do we have to work with and how can we meet that level and meet it successfully so that everyone has a prosperous present and future. So I like what Leo and Earl have both said. We have to be mindful that voluntary measures are not always adopted quickly. So we really need to, as I said, adopt a mindset. And I think it's very much the state's role to move everyone to a water conservation minded sort of lifestyle and for those kind of practices going forward. So thank you.
Thank you all for the feedback. And with that, that does bring us to the end of the questions that have been submitted up to this point. So with that being said, I believe we might be ready for some final closing thoughts from Vijay and others.
Thanks, Matt. I'm just going to end with a piece on a thank you to all of you for joining today, for all of your work over years to help get us to this point on water. And then the second piece is continue to ask for your engagement, calls to legislators, showing up, holding us accountable as state agencies, making sure that you are showing up in Topeka, making your voice heard on water, especially as we get into very, very difficult budget conversations this year. It's going to be very important that you work with your legislators and the governor's office and our administration on continuing to be hold us accountable to more money for water, more smart investment in water, and more effective use of taxpayer dollars. And so as we unveil some of these proposals over the next few weeks, we want these to be conversations. Provide your testimony, provide your views, but we can't take our foot off the gas on making sure that water is a fundamental investment in the state, similar to transportation. So I want to thank everybody for their time today, and hopefully we'll see you in Topeka with better audio and visual equipment moving forward. So thanks, everyone.